All right, hello everybody. Welcome back. This week we're talking about emotions. All right, so as usual, this PowerPoint goes beyond what's in the textbook. But first, let's review the definition of emotions. All right, our textbook says it's an intense reaction that indicates how we interpret the event, our physiological arousal, the way we label the experience, and how we manage our communication of that reaction. That definition could be a little different than one that you might use. But remember, interpersonal communication, we're all about providing specific terms and ways of understanding things so that we can explore them further, right? So this definition allows us to do that. But before we go on, let's talk about this idea of primary emotions, okay? Scholars agree that across all cultures, 6 emotions are displayed uniquely, okay, and consistently. So the 6 are anger, disgust, fear, joy, sadness, and surprise. Now you might be wondering, where's love in this? Well, interestingly enough, love seems to come up as what's called a blended emotion of a couple of these things. And actually there are at least 6 different kinds of love. You may be familiar with them. One of them is agape, for example. There's also platonic love. We're not really going to talk about love here, but we can suffice it to say love's a blended emotion. All right, so primary emotions and blended emotions. Primary emotions, they involve distinct patterns of physiological arousal, right? So each of those 6 types of primary emotion has along with it a distinct bodily or physiological reaction, okay? And what's interesting about that is that the physiological reaction, it's hard to determine which comes first. Is it the emotion or is it the physiological reaction? From this perspective, it's the idea that the emotion causes that, or it's a part of it. But there are studies that show that if a person's heart rate increases through breathing fast and things like that, that they can actually create these emotions. So it's hard to say. That's not really our concern here. All right, moving on. Blended emotions. These are the combining or blending, obviously, of 2 or more primary emotions, and they're experienced at the same time. And a really good example is jealousy. Right? Jealousy is blended. It mixes anger, fear, and sadness. And if you felt jealousy, you know that it's not fun to feel those 3 things together. And it's certainly not fun to be on the receiving end of somebody else's jealousy. Okay, now oftentimes in our society we use emotions interchangeably with the words feelings and moods. Moods maybe are a little different in popular culture, but a lot of us use feelings and emotions as the same thing. Now, scholarship says we need to differentiate those, and they say that feelings are brief emotional reactions resulting in limited arousal. Okay, so you have a limited physiological, biological arousal, right? Whereas emotions have pretty intense emotional or physiological reactions that go along with them. Okay, so feelings are brief and they are limited in terms of arousal. Moods are also very limited in terms of how much arousal they have. They're low intensity states, okay? But the difference is they last a long time, right? Moods can last all day, a number of days, okay? So moods, like feelings, are low intensity, moods being even lower, and they last longer than emotions do. So by this definition then, emotions occur occasionally and in response to substantial events, right? So sadness over a breakup or joy over the birth of a new member of your family. Whereas feelings arise throughout the day. They come and they go, right? You can feel good, you can feel bad, you can feel happy, you can feel sad throughout the day, right? Feelings come and go. And moods, as we stated earlier, they're both milder and longer lasting than both emotions and feelings. Right? So they can last all day long, and they can tend to be more consistent. My experience, moods also tend to be very closely associated with our personalities, right? Whether we're extroverted or introverted or other things like that. Now, I love the idea of emotional intelligence. Our book doesn't talk about it too much. it touches on it briefly. But this is an idea made popular by a book by a man named Daniel Goldman, a PhD in psychology. And what's cool about interpersonal communication, and I think all university courses, is that the material overlaps a lot. And interpersonal communication takes a lot from psychology and adds its own particular flair to it. Right? So the idea of emotional intelligence, according to a psychologist, is the capacity for recognizing our own feelings and those of others, for motivating ourselves, and for managing emotions well in ourselves and in our relationships. I think that speaks for itself. Goldman wrote this textbook, or this book, for average people. He did not write it for his colleagues, right? So that definition is, I think, clear and pretty straight to the point. And a second definition of emotional intelligence, I think, is more specific, but it's nice to have that first one under your belt before you see this one. This complicates it a little bit. And it says, emotional intelligence is an ability to recognize the meanings of emotion in their relationships and to reason and problem solve on the basis of them. It is involved in the capacity to perceive emotions, assimilate emotion-related feelings, understand the information of those emotions, and manage them. Right? So you've got perception, assimilating those emotions into your understanding of the world, and managing those emotions. Right? Some of you might consider yourselves emotionally intelligent, others may not. Some of you may not have ever heard this term before. Right? Back in the 50s, I don't think they really cared too much about anybody's emotional intelligence. Emotions were generally swept under the rug and not considered something of much importance. As you may or may not know, that led to a whole lot of problems for a lot of people, at least people in my parents' generation, who then had to find ways to let their emotions out. In today's world, we understand that dealing with emotion and understanding your emotions is really critical, very important for being a healthy and happy human being. And studies show that an individual's emotional intelligence is determined, at least in part, by our ability to communicate clearly about our feelings. So it's not just being able to hear them or understand our feelings and be aware of them, it's also about communicating them, letting other people know how we're feeling, right? And with that goes that idea that we need to let people know how we're feeling, all the different ways we're feeling, right? If you just tell somebody, I'm mad at you, that might not quite do it. If you tell them, I'm mad at you because I'm frustrated with how you treat me and I'm confused about what this means in our relationship, that's pretty darn good. That's pretty emotionally intelligent, right? If you just tell them you're mad at them, it's kind of hard to see where that conversation would go. And how we communicate about our feelings depends, according to the research. The research says that it depends on how we've learned to value and process emotions. So in our families, in our intimate relations with people, and over the years, how we've learned to deal with emotion. Right? So if you come from a family that doesn't deal openly with emotion, you might struggle here in your ability to communicate and in your overall emotional intelligence. But according to Dr. Goldman, it's not every human being has the power to develop their emotional intelligence. It just takes work, just like anything, right? If you want to learn to play tennis, you've got to practice. Okay, now following that idea of emotional intelligence, or using our emotional intelligence, we can then tap into the idea of display rules. Right? This is another term new to most of you. And basically, display rules are cultural norms that guide appropriate ways to manage and communicate emotions. Right? So we understand how we're supposed to manage our emotions and communicate those in different settings. You wouldn't walk into work at 9 o'clock in the morning and start yelling at people, I'm so mad at you, I can't believe you did this, the office is a mess. Right? However, you might do that with your child, or you might do that with your significant other. You might walk in at home and say, give your wife's husband, significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, a kiss on the cheek and say, oh, I missed you all day today, right? Missing being the emotion you're communicating, or the blended emotion. Whereas you wouldn't do that at work, right? And so display rules speak to how we display our emotion in different places, right? Ideally, you operate in a number of different areas where you get to display more of your emotions than not. If you're always stifling them in all of your situations, you've probably got a lot of emotion pent up. And you probably, if you look at your life, you probably have other certain places where you need to let it out. Maybe you go for really hard workouts Maybe you like to go dancing and you like to go crazy on the dance floor. It's one of the only places you can really let yourself be free, right? But every cultural group and co-culture has display rules. Right? Now, looking at that and looking at gender, research shows that women are more likely than men are to express their emotions, and emotions in particular that support relationships. Right? They're more likely to suppress emotions that assert their interests over others. Right? So they're less likely to express emotions that will promote competitiveness and things like that. Instead, they'll express those emotions that build relationships, right? Like I like you, or I felt really sad when this happened, things like that. And across cultures, women report experiencing more sadness, fear, shame, and guilt, and also expressing that, whereas men report feeling more anger and other hostile emotions, right? So men and women have different display rules for what they're allowed to show, right? And whether what they're allowed to show shapes what they feel, that's a matter for more discussion, I'm sure. Nothing that we're going to really go too deeply into here, but it just brings up these ideas, right? That women and men have different display rules for how they can behave, and you might think about how that shapes how men and women develop their own emotional intelligence, right? Men who grew up in homes that promote being tough and quiet and stoical might not, they might always follow those display rules, even in places like an intimate relationship where they're encouraged to share their emotions, right? Whereas a woman who's been encouraged to be very emotional and very open and with her feelings might find it a real struggle to work in, say, to use a stereotype, to work in the information technology department, right, with all the computer men and women, right, where that culture tends to be really closed off to emotion. And if she comes in displaying all of these, more of this sadness, fear, or shame, then she might not quite fit in there because people aren't supposed to show those kinds of emotions, where she was taught that women are. All right, so emotions are a huge and complicated field of study, but this chapter focuses on some basic issues and lets us begin the discussion. And with so many things in interpersonal communication, and pretty much anything I think you start studying in greater and greater depth, emotions could be a field you took on to do PhD or master's work in, right? If you really find it interesting, it could be a whole field unto itself. But hopefully, the reading in this PowerPoint helped you scratch the surface. All right, have a good week.